when we talk about New York City, we're actually talking about the 5 boroughs that make up the city. And strangely enough, of the 4 out of the 5 boroughs are actually completely islands. Only the Bronx is part of the continental USA. But we tend to concentrate on the one island, which is Manhattan. So most people in their minds view New York as being the island of Manhattan. Manhattan's got population within all the boroughs, roughly about 9 million people. In the wider metropolitan area, 19 million people. It's the largest city in the United States. The city itself has dominated the last couple of decades of the 20th century and the 21st century to date. It has seen awful tragedies, obviously the 9/11 Twin Towers tragedy, as well as it seems to have borne the brunt of the COVID pandemic in the USA. It is a city, however, that shows amazing resilience. It has always rebuilt itself. It is a constantly evolving city. For those travellers who might have been in New York in the 1980s, it was the most dangerous city in the world. You wouldn't dare walk outside on the street after 6 p.m. Whereas within 20 years, it was one of the safest cities in the world to go to. You can stroll through Central Park, which I've done with several groups, very late at night, early morning, and it's a wonderful, wonderful city to explore and see. It is the dynamism and constant change of the city that makes it so fascinating for those of us who love New York that much. It is the commercial, historical, cultural core of New York. And main thing to emphasize is actually the commercial core. The city was founded as a trading port, mainly due to the access of the Hudson River running up the east of the Manhattan Island to access fur pelts, trading with the native Indians. And it has stayed a commercial center. The city of Washington was set up as a political capital and very grand. New York has always been about making money, and there's been some amazing characters right throughout the history of New York who have made a lot of money and lost a lot of money in New York City. The 5 boroughs there, the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and Manhattan Island. Over today and tomorrow, we're actually doing 2 tours. Matthew and Sterling have come up from Florida to have a weekend in New York, and we thought what a great opportunity to get him to do a couple of walking tours. And we're going to concentrate on 2 very distinct districts of the Manhattan Island. The first one is the historic downtown or financial district of New York. And then tomorrow morning, same time tomorrow morning, I hope you can join us, we're going to be doing the very unique Midtown architecture of the Midtown area, which by the nature of the evolution of the island has this rather special striking skyline and some of the most unique buildings around. I'll give you a quick overview, an image of where we are right now. So Matthew is actually standing down on the Brooklyn Bridge here. And we'll be walking through past the Woolworth Building, City Hall, down St. Paul's Chapel, the 9/11 Memorial, and then making our way down the financial district to Wall Street. And so it's a great combination of history, colonial history, modern history, and some of the amazing sights of the city. So enough rabbiting on from me. I'll just turn it over to you, Matthew. What is a fabulous location that you're on now?
Great. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
If there's a little bit of wind squall across the microphone, bear with us. This is on days like today. I wonder why I ever leave Florida, but it's about 8 degrees up on the bridge here today. A bit of a late spring cold front over the city today. So yeah, we decided to start up on the Brooklyn Bridge, which spans 2 of those great boroughs of New York City. The first one, the one you're looking at right here, is Manhattan, and the area that we're going to be walking down into, the financial district. As you can see, the lights are coming on as we move into twilight. And then this bridge connects on the other side, Brooklyn, which you can also see a large amount of tall buildings there. once upon a time, in fact, for a lot of New York's history, these were two independent cities. Brooklyn was set up as a separate farming town and village by the Dutch shortly after Manhattan was founded. And until the 1860s, the only way you could cross between New York and Brooklyn was by ferry. And so once upon a time, these two great boroughs, which were the first and fourth largest city in the United States in the 19th century, this river, the East River, which we're standing over, would have been absolutely chock-a-block full of ferries and small pontoons and other ships bringing commuters between the two sides. The bridge we're standing on today, the Brooklyn Bridge, is really one of those technological marvels of New York. It's a wonder of the modern world. It was, at its day, the longest and most complicated bridge in the United States. The East River is quite wide, much wider than bridges were normally able to span in the 1860s when plans were made to make this bridge. But in 1869, an ambitious plan to construct a new bridge using new technology was created. A man named John Augustus Roebling decided it would be possible to build a bridge using suspension technology. And you see all the cables coming down. We know, of course, suspension bridges today is fairly modern. Most normal long bridges are made this way. But this was one of the very first applications of this technology in the world. And it was happening right here in New York City to connect these two great bridges. And as we walk through the bridge, I'll talk a little bit about its construction, because it's one of the first really interesting stories I can tell about New York City and how it's always been a center of innovation. This large pylon you see here is the core of what keeps the bridge standing up. It's what makes the suspension bridge work. It allows weight to be transferred from the span of the bridge via cables into the pylon and then down into the foundations below. In order to sink these giant pylons into the riverbed underneath the East River, what they had to do was dig underneath the water in order to create foundations for the pylons to stand on. And the way they did it was an incredibly ambitious technology of the day. They essentially created large wooden boxes called caissons. And if you've ever put a glass of water onto an empty glass onto the surface of the water and push it down, you will have seen that the water, a little air bubble will stick inside the glass unless you tip it. So a caisson is the same principle. John Augustus Roebling said it could be done if we create these large wooden boxes, watertight, airtight, and place them over the top of the water. We'll be able to take an air bubble down with this, and inside that air bubble, people will be able to dig down into the riverbed and create the foundations. So Roebling, John Augustus Roebling, the original designer, died shortly after the planning of the bridge was completed. He was standing on the other side of the river right there today where the seaport was, surveying the site, when a tugboat crashed into the ferry dock and crushed his foot. Roebling was an eccentric man and believed in water cures, including the idea that if he simply poured water 24 hours a day over his crushed and gangrenous foot, it would cure it magically. Of course, it didn't cure it. He died of gangrene. Then his son, George Washington Roebling, took over construction of the bridge. George Washington Roebling, though, soon discovered one problem with the caisson technology system being used to dig these massive pylons. And that was a condition that was not known at this point, called pressure sickness or decompression sickness. Having all of that high pressure air forced under the water and having workers in there for sometimes 12 hours a day was incredibly tough on the body. And of course, having adjusted to that high pressure air situation underneath the water, when they came back up, they started noticing strange conditions like nosebleeds. Eventually, some people started dying for no well understood reason. We now know, of course, today that this is the bends, when high pressure air gets stuck in your bloodstream or in your pulmonary system and causes a blockage or an embolism. George Washington Roebling also succumbed to this. As the designer of the bridge, he was down the caissons numerous times. Eventually, he noticed he started losing feeling in his legs. Before long, he was paralyzed from the neck down. So then it fell to his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, who knew nothing about bridge engineering until her husband said this bridge will never get completed unless someone takes over the project. So Emily Warren Roebling basically taught herself engineering and mathematics so that she could oversee the construction of the bridge. As a result, there is a memorial today at the bottom of the bridge, which I put on the slide there, that commemorates the three designers of the Brooklyn Bridge. And it finally opened in 1883. It was considered an grand miracle. And in fact, it was so well designed that it still stands today, largely in its original form. John Augustus Roebling made the bridge 6 times stronger than it needed to be, considering the idea that the bridge would have more traffic on it in the future than it would in the 1860s, and that there might be structural faults and problems in the materials that might need to be compensated for. He turned out to be right. The Brooklyn Bridge has about 8 times as much traffic as they were initially anticipated in the 1860s. It now has also railway coming over it, as well as cars constantly going over, as you can see today. It also had various failings in the cabling system due to corrupt contractors, but due to John Augustus Roebling's intuitive design, it means that it still stands largely in its original form today. And as you can see, as we're going around, tourists have started to return to New York. It's also a very popular way to walk between the 2 boroughs, as well as being one of the major thoroughfares across the city. Of course, the Brooklyn Bridge was just the first. There are now 12 ways to cross between Manhattan Island and either Brooklyn on one side and Queens, or on the other side to New Jersey. There are also tunnels under the water as well. So there are many different ways to get in. As we walk down this part of the Brooklyn Bridge towards downtown, I'll take the opportunity to point out some interesting buildings as we go along, but also talk a little bit generally about the history of the city. It's a bit hard to tell a chronological story of New York because what we're constantly surrounded with is new and old buildings. This is always the way it's been. In fact, even as we're walking through today, Sterling and I, who haven't been here in the 13 months since the pandemic started, noticed all sorts of buildings and construction we hadn't seen before. But the original reason, as Stuart said, for people to come to New York has always been about money. That goes to the core of the city. It runs in its blood, really. When Henry Hudson first sailed up the Hudson River in 1609, Hudson was working for the Dutch East India Company looking for the Northwest Passage. He was looking for a shorter route to get to Hong Kong to help with the spice trade. They thought at the time that the Hudson River was the best prospect in order to cross across Canada and into Asia. That turned out to be incorrect. You can only get as far as Albany through the Hudson River. However, when Hudson was crossing up here, firstly, he saw that the island of Manhattan was inhabited by many people, the Lenape. The Lenape Indians would use Manhattan as a place for trade themselves. So the original Native Americans also kind of used this as a commercial meeting place. But not only that, but he also noticed that there were beavers everywhere, all across the woodlands, and that the natives had plenty of beaver pelts to sell. And this happened to be the reason why New York was founded, because at that very moment in Europe, there was something known as the beaver shortage. The European beaver had been hunted pretty much to extinction to be used in the creation of fur hats. All those Elizabethan collars and hats that are made out of furs, they were always usually made out of beaver fur, sometimes from Eastern Europe, then from Russia, and then eventually created from American furs. So the Dutch East India Company set up a trading post in 1620 on Manhattan in order to collect beaver pelts and to sell them back in Europe. It was a distinctly second-tier kind of destination. The Dutch were never very interested in this particular port. It was rowdy, it was far away from everything. The real money to be made in the colonial world in the 1600s was in sugar. So the Caribbean was much, much more valuable. The Dutch outpost here was kind of a backwater. If you were of an down and outer and wanted to make your fortune somewhere, if you didn't really have noble birth but you wanted to come up in the world, maybe you'd come to New York, because they were much less strict about social class, and it was considered a sort of a place for a person to come up in the world. And I think what's interesting is that is the philosophy and the way that New York still is today. It's always been a place where immigrants, with people with no status, can come and make their fortune. And some of the stories I kind of will tell as we go through the city are like that. As we're walking down the bridge, I'll point out this kind of tall, very modern, sleek-looking building here, largely lacking in fenestration. This is kind of a building that I always think is interesting to point out. It is the world's largest telephone exchange. You can see Verizon, which is the name of a large phone company, on the top. If you can think about the number of phone connections in Manhattan alone, initially this building was built in the 70s to deal with all those telephone switch blocks, making all the connections between phone calls in the city. Over the years, it started to be replaced though. Now it's one of the world's largest internet servers. Again, dealing with internet traffic, but kind of a sign of the times as we go through. This large collection of brown buildings right next to it, completely different meaning, completely different architectural period, and completely different function. This is Housing Commission. You'll see these buildings all over New York, these tall, brown, asterisk-shaped buildings. These are called the Charles Venn houses. They're all, complexes like this can be found all over the city. The city of New York maintains Housing Commission to this day in order to allow for people to who work in the service industry, who are housekeepers in hotels, who are gardeners and groundskeepers, people of that nature, can still afford to live in Manhattan. Because after all, if it was all just priced by the market, there'd just be nowhere for people working on modest incomes to live. So there are actually large amounts of Housing Commission all around lower New York and downtown Manhattan, and even some up near Midtown, which we'll kind of go near tomorrow. And so they're still dotted all around the place. A lot of pressure in recent years for the government to sell out this land to developers, but so far the city of New York has resisted any such plans, feeling it's important to keep a diversity of people living on the island. Of course, that's still only a fairly small percentage of the amount of people who live on Manhattan. Manhattan is a very expensive place to live. And of course, the vast majority of people who live here are of some means and work in the financial district, but there's a little bit of that diversity deliberately maintained by the government. Stuart was asking me a little bit before about COVID and what's it been like here in New York. So it's sort of interesting because at the moment, America is very divided over the politics of the pandemic and vis-a-vis, kind of mask ordinances and that kind of thing. New York, being a democratic state, has taken the pandemic pretty seriously. There are mask orders still for most buildings. And at the moment, there's a system that has been developed called vaccine passports. And this requires you, if you've had your vaccine, to register with the New York City government, and you get a little code on your phone. And so when you go to a venue, for example, a bar or a restaurant, you can scan your QR code from your phone, and it will verify to that venue that you've had a vaccination. Therefore, it's safe for you to go in, not wear a mask, etc. If you haven't, then you have to follow quarantining or social distancing procedures. This is very controversial. Where we're from in Florida, such vaccine passport ideas are actually been made illegal because there are so many people in Florida who are refusing to get the vaccine and kind of see it as a contentious or divisive issue. So a kind of a real mix of things going on. But as you can see on the streets, people in New York have started to return, and that's our observation too. It's still pretty quiet by New York standards. Even though the Brooklyn Bridge looks kind of busy, this is very, very quiet, especially for a Saturday. But there are tourists returning to the city. There is life coming back again. Now that the United States is hitting about 50% vaccination rate, people have started to return to normal by and large.
Matthew, do you know, because here in Australia there's quite a big discussion because everyone's been working from home, do you know that people are coming back to work in the city, or are they still been working from home? And is it going to...
There's a lot of remote work, and in fact I'll probably touch on that a little bit because it's actually a problem that the city is going to face post-pandemic. Obviously downtown New York is office space primarily, and so traditionally, although there are some apartment blocks and people moving into old commercial space, this is one of the largest areas of rentable office space in the world. And yet there are companies who are now pledging or are going to go fully remote permanently post-pandemic. So there may well be a kind of glut of office space and real estate in the city, which is going to cause a huge challenge to manage. On some ways it'll be good because it means there's less traffic and less pressure on public transport in the city. But on the other hand, of course, you're going to have high vacancy rates, and what will that do? So a kind of challenge to be dealt with.
Yeah.
So now we're getting down to the area known as Civic Plaza. We've come off the bridge, and we're sort of walking right in the middle of all of the government buildings for New York. The downtown part of New York was for a long time, really until the early 20th century, the sort of area that you would kind of identify as New York City. So if you were to see it on a postcard or something like that, this area was New York. Now, today, a lot of the most recognizable icons of New York have shifted up to Midtown. But back in the day, this is why a lot of the city government is located down here. A couple of the buildings that I'll point out. The first is this very tall building on the other side of the street. It's called the Manhattan Municipal Building. It was built in 1914. And this building was once upon a time the equivalent of the city government just for the island of Manhattan. You can't see the details on the outside, probably from where standing really clearly, but on a slide I put up for CERN, you can see the seal of the city of New York. It's covered on the outside with various symbols of the city's prosperity, particularly the beaver, the windmill representing the Dutch, and the flour barrel representing what those windmills milled when they were originally here. The Manhattan Municipal Building is essentially one of the oldest city halls. There used to be, each borough used to have its own individual government with its individual borough president. Now they do still have a borough president, but they're not really an important figure. They're more like an elected cheerleader. So a lot of the city government's sort of functions are now located just there, sort of like an administrative building. On the top of the building, and a slide should be able to show it in more detail, is a famous statue called Civic Fame. And it was built to commemorate the unification of the 5 boroughs into the modern city of New York. And the person depicted in that statue has a really interesting kind of New York story about it. Her name was Audrey Munson. And so this statue and about 60 other statues in New York City were based on her. She was considered the first supermodel in the world. She was the first woman also to appear nude in a film in 1915, a silent film called Inspiration. So she was kind of considered this great muse and beauty of New York. And once you kind of know her story and know her face, funnily enough, you will see her in various statues in parks around the place because she was in great demand to be a sort of a model for various kind of pieces of statuary around the city. Kind of tragic end to Audrey. She lived in an apartment down here in downtown New York, and at the sort of height of her fame, she was approached by the landlord of the building she was lived in, who declared his undying love for her. Audrey wasn't interested in this man who was much older and sort of deflected and said, well, you're a married man, and of course, you know, nothing can ever happen, can it? And so taking this as a sign, the landlord murdered his wife and then claimed that Audrey had tempted him to do it so that he could be free to wed her. Of course, you know, they went on a trial of the century to see, you know, whether Audrey had sort of provoked this murder. It obviously wasn't considered true, and he was declared insane. But Audrey, unfortunately, never really recovered from the incident. She herself ended up losing all of her contracts and not being hired again as being too controversial. Eventually, she herself developed a sort of schizophrenic disorder and was committed to a mental asylum here in New York. But she lived down here in the downtown mental asylum until 1996. She lived till 105. So kind of a sad end to her story. But a lot of the statues around downtown New York have her face on it. Some of the other buildings around the Civic Park, this is the probate court, a building that I never paid much attention to until I read an article in New York Magazine about it 5 years ago, in which this is apparently one of the most contentious buildings in New York, insofar as this is where all of the cases about disputed land titles in the city go to, especially when they're apparently, whenever someone dies in New York and no one really knows who owns the land because the land is owned so valuable, it always ends up here, and they always end up finding cousins coming out of the woodwork claiming, you know, dear great aunt Muriel must have meant it for me, etc. So, you know, even the kind of most innocuous buildings have an interesting tinge to them in New York. The area we're also standing on, though, even though today it's sort of these fully grand public buildings, initially this was actually the very edge of the city, and once upon a time, the main water supply for New York was sourced just north of the probate court building, an area called Collect Pond. And right next to Collect Pond was the vast outfields of the city, where only in recent decades have they started to dig up and find some of the original archaeological evidence of New York, including the African American burial ground, which is now one of the most important archaeological sites in New York. We can't really see much of it. It's still being excavated. Some of it has been turned into a national park site, but as many as 40,000 African American bodies were just dumped on the other side of those buildings, or where those buildings are today, in the 17 and 1800s, and given no proper burials, no markers. They were probably slaves, and not afforded any of those dignities. And so today the city is painstakingly trying to dig up parts of this area and find out, some of that true history that was built over. Now I want to walk past another one of these civic buildings and talk about the Tweed Courthouse, which we're approaching now. Tweed Courthouse is named after William Boss Tweed. I put on one of the slides that probably Stuart can throw up there and show you. And it's kind of an interesting little side note in the history of New York. The Boss Tweed, you might have heard this name. William Boss Tweed was one of the most powerful men in New York throughout the 19th century, and he represented an institution called Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall dominated New York politics for about 120 years. It was a Democratic Party institution which controlled elections in the city through its connections to immigrants. And it's sort of an interesting system that emerged in New York, kind of a political machine that emerged. Essentially, the system involved helping immigrants get integrated into the city. Throughout the 19th century, millions of immigrants came into New York every single year. And of course, many of them came from places where they had very little support system here when they arrived. Tammany Hall was made up essentially of enterprising individuals who saw an opportunity to help immigrants in exchange for political power. And so if you were to come down to the docks here in New York City as an immigrant, say from Hungary, you didn't know the language or you didn't know how to get started, you'd probably hear someone calling out in Hungarian saying, "New immigrants, come see me, we'll help you." And then the man from Tammany Hall, they'd help you get a job, they'd help you get your citizenship, they might even be able to help introduce you to other Hungarians and maybe even help set you up with a Hungarian bride here. All they would ask for all of this assistance is that when it came for the election time, that you would go in and you'd vote for them. In New York City until the 1890s, all voting was done publicly. You went into the voting hall and you stood up and you said, "I vote for this person." So of course, Tammany Hall could stand in and check off whether people they were supporting had voted for them or not. Well, this was essentially the first welfare system in the United States. The government didn't provide for immigrants, so Tammany Hall kind of filled that gap. But in exchange for that, they took over the city's politics. How Tweed Courthouse fits into this is the best example of what the Tammany Hall system built. In order to pay back all of their own people who are helping immigrants and using money to buy votes, they needed to put money into their own pockets. And so the system that Tammany Hall set up was that whenever a public building went up in town, they'd make the building as grand and as expensive as possible, and in the process they would then graft off the side. They'd pay contractors outrageous fees for the most sumptuous materials, and then everyone would take their 10% cut. Tweed Hall is one of the most expensive buildings ever built in the United States. It was twice as much money than the purchase of Alaska in 1870, and it was 4 times as much as the construction of the Palace of Westminster, which happened in about the same year, 1876. So how did they spend 4 times as much as Westminster in London on this building? Well, by just putting in the most ridiculous materials possible. It's filled with the rarest and most expensive marbles imaginable, or with a 10, 20, 30, 40% markup for all the contractors. William Boss Tweed, who was effectively the grand sachem of Tammany Hall, who instituted this system. It was named after him. He was the man. He was never mayor or any elected position in the city, but everyone knew if you wanted to get anything done, you spoke to Boss Tweed. Stuart can put up a slide which shows the interior of the Tweed Courthouse and some of the sumptuous marbles and materials that were used to construct it. Well, that system lasted for a long time. Boss Tweed didn't last forever in the position. Tweed Courthouse was considered so outrageous and so expensive, even by the already very corrupt standards of New York, that the newspapers eventually did an investigation, and Tweed was exposed. He ended up going on trial inside his own unfinished courthouse. It didn't have a roof on it, but symbolically they wanted to conduct the trial there. He was found guilty. He did escape from jail and didn't sort of serve an awful lot of time, but that's kind of why the name stuck. And so even today, the city still calls it Tweed Courthouse, even though it's sort of named after one of the most corrupt men in the city's history. But interestingly, the Tammany system continued until the 1930s, so it didn't die with Tweed. That system, that need for kind of a combined political welfare system seemed to be pretty strong in New York. And even today, some of New York City's politics still bears some relationship to that. New immigrant groups are some of the most powerful voting blocs in the city, and often the mayor, who is able to build the biggest coalition of immigrant groups is usually the one who's able to secure a kind of electoral win. So there's very much that element to New York City politics today. We are going to continue in front of Tweed Courthouse. You see New York City Hall, which was built in 1813, so an earlier building by the firm of Mangan and McComb. A very small French Renaissance style building, kind of surprisingly small given how large New York City is. Just to give you a sense, the City Hall manages 300,000 employees. That's how many people work for the city of New York. To contrast that, Coles, which is the largest corporation in Australia, last time I checked, has 220,000 employees across the country. So the New York City government is massive. It's an enormous kind of country-size operation. Politically, of course, they oversee a constituency of nearly, 11 or 12 million people living within the 5 boroughs. There are 51 members of the council. It is very heavily dominated by Democrats. I put a little slide up which has the kind of current breakdown. I think it's 47 Democrats, only 3 Republicans and a couple of vacants or something like that. It's a very ridiculously lopsided situation, but nearly all of those Republican representatives just come from Staten Island, that borough that's far to the south of the city. So, but as a result, the New York City Council is a little bit like a legislature or parliament, given the size of the city and the size of the government. We're now going to walk in front of the City Hall into an area called City Hall Park. But if you look on the other side of the street, you can see the remains, these large, this red brick building and this masonry white building next to it. These are the remains of some of the original newspaper headquarters in New York, because this was the center of city politics and initially really one of the centers of the city. This was called Newspaper Row. I put a slide with a postcard that was sent from the 19th century of Newspaper Row. People would visit the city and this would be the kind of famous shot you would send of people. This is where the New York Times, the New York Globe, the New York World, they're all located down here on this street. Today, all of those have moved up on other places. We now have Times Square, which kind of is named after the newspaper where the newspaper moved in the late 19th century. But in its heyday, this was actually one of the most important publishing centers in the Western world, but now kind of being converted into apartment blocks and new use. As we walk through City Hall Park, which is looking quite nice with all the spring growth. Normally I'm here in winter and it's pretty unappealing, but we're going to look up to the Woolworth Building, and it's the next kind of site I want to point out down here. So this very tall building, in fact, it was the tallest building in the world between 1913 and 1930. The Woolworth Building is one of the probably most important skyscrapers in the, history of construction. It was, for its day, extremely technically complicated and sophisticated. And it kind of represented the start of the skyscraper era in New York. Up until the point of the Woolworth Building, there had been smaller skyscrapers experimented with all throughout the 1890s and early 1900s. But the Woolworth Building kind of took us into the super tall era. The story behind the Woolworth Building is kind of interesting. It was named after Frank W. Woolworth, who was the inventor of, I guess, one of the inventors of what we would call the modern supermarket. The concept stores which Frank set up in the 1890s were called five and dimes. These were stores that, unlike dry goods stores that existed before that, they would have things like pre-packaged amounts of flour. Rather than having big barrels that you scooped out and paid for, he'd have a little packet of flour and you bought it from over the counter. Or things like customers picking out things themselves rather than asking the shop assistant to give them everything they want. Consistent and clear pricing on a label on the product, something that wasn't really common before the late 19th century. These were the sort of innovations that we would now recognize as part of a supermarket. Well, Frank stores were incredibly popular. There were over 200 built within the first 20 years of operation, I think 600 within the first 30. And Woolworths became this massive institution. It became so big that there were international copycat brands set up. So Woolworths in Australia is named after the American Woolworths, but they weren't related. Same with the British Woolworths and the South African Woolworths. They copied the name, but they don't really related. So Frank W. Woolworth was an incredibly wealthy man. And like many wealthy men in the 19th century and early 20th century, he came to New York to build a house and set up once he'd made his fortune in the Midwest, and decided to build a headquarters for Woolworths here in the city. Initially, it wasn't planned to be the tallest building in the world, but he seems to have got into a local bet with some of the members of his local gentlemen's club and been egged on by the idea of doing something bigger, taller, greater than ever. And so he worked with an architect named Cass Gilbert to build a new super tall building. Kind of ironic because Frank W. Woolworth is scared of heights, and his own office is actually only on the second floor of the building. But what they ended up building was the tallest in the world. The legend has it, it's known he paid for it in cash. The legend is that he paid for it in 5 and 10 cent pieces. That's probably not true, but he did all of his transactions in cash. And I threw up a slide there that allows you to see the inside of the building. It has all sorts of really interesting architectural features. It was done in a neo-Gothic style. If you can imagine, there was no kind of comparison point for super tall buildings at the turn of the century. So what did you kind of copy when you were coming up with a style for a building? Well, the comparison point that the first architects of skyscrapers used was neo-Gothic cathedrals. These were the only other tall buildings in the world that existed. So of course it kind of made sense to make your building neo-Gothic. You can see from the beautiful lobby of the Woolworth building these sort of neo-Gothic features, and it even has gargoyles inside it. And there's a really cool gargoyle of Frank W. Woolworth himself with counting his nickels and dimes in his hand. And there's also gargoyles in there of the architects, sort of modern interpretations of Gothic art. So it's kind of a truly interesting building. Today, it's no longer a big corporate headquarters. It's pent at the very top of the crown there, which we might be able to see. It's kind of lit up in gold at the moment. That's been turned into a penthouse, $79 million if you want to buy it. It occupies the sort of top 3 little mini floors in time to the belfry of the building. A lot of the old buildings in downtown New York are now being converted into apartments as the nature of the city sort of changes. All right, we are going to cross over here and then start working our way towards the 9/11 Memorial and St. Paul's Chapel. Yeah, we'll cross that way. Yep.
So Matthew, obviously we're crossing over the famous Broadway.
Oh yeah, this is Broadway. Yep.
The great avenue running from the tip of Manhattan all the way up to Albany, the state capital, and that one weird diagonal street running up right through the island of Manhattan.
Yep, that was Broadway was originally the Lenape Indian track when the Dutch got here. So this was the one. There's a reason why Broadway doesn't follow the street pattern, and it's because when the Dutch came here, there was already a track that the Lenape Indians used to get from the south to the north tip of the island. So they turned it into a road. It's comes from the Dutch Broederweg, or farmer's way or farm way. That was originally the path you would take to get up to the farms at the north of Manhattan. So, all right, so the building we're now looking at here is St. Paul's Chapel. We'll cross over, I guess, to get a little bit closer to it. And it's one of the only colonial era buildings left in New York City. I guess the reason we don't think of New York as a very historical city in a sense is because there isn't any of this kind of old English architecture left. The reason is pretty simple. During the Revolutionary War, there was a huge fire that broke out, and most of the old buildings of Lower Manhattan were burned down. St. Paul's Chapel from 1769 is one of the few buildings that's left. Initially, St. Paul's Chapel was actually called a church of convenience. It was built as a sort of a sister church to Trinity Church, which is further down Broadway, but for people living on the north side of the Wall Street, which will go down before, used to be where there literally was a wall between old New Amsterdam and the rest of the city. And so this chapel was kind of built north of the wall to service people who are living up here. St. Paul's Chapel, though, has a kind of a new meaning to a lot of Americans now, as it's become a shrine in some ways to the 9/11 disaster. Because we're right in front of the World Trade Center, St. Paul's Chapel was used as an area of relief. In fact, for 8 months, volunteers worked here 24 hours a day in order to assist survivors and help the rescue efforts. The building is quite pretty. The stone on the outside is actually Manhattan schist, the very rock that Manhattan Island is built upon. And if you recognize the design, if you've been to London, there's a reason for that. It's pretty much an exact copy of St. Martin's in the Fields. We're going to walk down behind St. Paul's. As we do, I don't know if Stuart threw it up, but there's a slide you can see of what St. Paul's Chapel's graveyard looked like on September 12th, 2001. And you can see it was absolutely covered with debris. It was considered pretty miraculous, in fact, that nothing in St. Paul's Chapel was damaged by the collapse of the Twin Towers, even though the building was fairly well covered by debris from the falling buildings, and many of the surrounding buildings had to be demolished due to structural problems that were created by the collapse. St. Paul's Chapel still stands relatively intact. So now we're going to make our way towards the World Trade Center site. The building that's looming up in front of us now is the newly constructed Freedom Tower, or number 1 World Trade Center. This is the tallest building on the site, exactly 1,776 feet in height, of course, to reference the Declaration of Independence. I'll talk a little bit more about the building when we get closer to it, but there's another building before that that's going to demand our attention first, and it's the fairly new World Trade Center Transit Hub that was constructed by the famous architect Santiago Calatrava and finished in 2016. A massive multi-billion-dollar redevelopment that brings together many of the subway lines underneath the World Trade Center. Calatrava's design was inspired, in his words, by the opening wings of a dove to kind of represent peace. Sterling is going to run inside and show you what it looks like from the inside, because it's a beautiful building, and inside it has a feature called the Oculus, this large window feature that crosses down the middle of the building that is designed to allow light to shine into the building at exactly the right angle around the equinox every year, which pretty much coincides with September 11th. And so at that point, sort of light bathes the building through the oculus in the middle. I won't walk in with it, although just so we don't arouse any suspicion. But
no, it's absolutely fantastic vision. It looks stunning inside. I don't think a lot of people realise that the original World Trade Center, the Twin Towers, they think of it as just two towers, but it itself was a major transport hub owned by the Port Authority. And so this just replicates this massive transport hub. And in a way, it's thinking of this is the Grand Central Terminal of the 21st century, this new Oculus.
Absolutely. It's all coloured up at the moment for Memorial Day. It's Memorial Day weekend. This is probably the equivalent, I guess, of our Anzac Day, a sort of important veterans-related holiday. So there's flags up in red, white, and blue.
And that would answer one of the questions Graham asked: why does some of the flags seem to be at half-mast today? But it's
the Memorial Day thing. Yeah, that's right.
And actually, just been asked, that Oculus in Calatrava's work, is it has been controversial in New York, as a lot of his work has been in Spain and Italy?
Yes, I think the derogatory term you see in the New York magazine is the kitsch stegosaurus. And partly it's the design, but actually more it's to do with the fact that the shopping mall is a Westfield shopping mall. So Australians can take some pride or shame in that. But the idea of building a giant mall on the top of what essentially is a mass grave is obviously controversial, but it's a difficult issue because this is some of the most valuable land in the world. And so, the degree to which you can say, well, let's close it off, shut it off, not allow it to be used again, is difficult. And there's been a real challenge to balance the interest between commercial interests and starting up the city again and redeveloping this area, and others who want to have more memorialization and more somber tone. So yeah, the idea that building a giant mall here hasn't been completely free of controversy. Also, it was extremely expensive, like a lot of Calatrava's designs end up being. But yeah, I mean, the controversy is not too dissimilar with the Freedom Tower design. So as Stuart says, the World Trade Center site, there are actually 7 buildings, technically, that occupy or are part of the modern World Trade Center. The Freedom Tower is number 1, but 2, 3, 4, 5, they'll be visible as we walk past or behind or around the 9/11 memorial. But Freedom Tower is kind of an interesting one, because and I've got a slide in there somewhere that shows the original design for this building that actually won the design competition. Initially, when they're kind of planning to reconstruct the site, and Daniel Lieskind won the competition to design this very interesting shard-like memorial building that would have had these incredible sort of aerial gardens and vertical gardens attached to the outside. It was a really kind of daring, innovative, new kind of concept. But there was a whole lot of argument between the architect's firm and the development managers, essentially over the question of a floor space, because the people who actually hold the lease to the World Trade Center site for all the real estate had taken over the lease pretty shortly before the 9/11 attacks. So they were facing, a pretty severe financial crunch. They needed to make money of leases of this site, and essentially Lieskind's design didn't have enough rentable office space inside it. And so in the end, what they ended up building was this second design by David Childs, which is really nowhere near as innovative and nowhere near as interesting, but kind of maximizes the amount of usable floor space. So, again, this is a controversial idea. How do you adequately memorialize something like this site? Now we're getting down to the actual 9/11 memorial themselves. And these were designed by Michael Arad, who was an Israeli architect who won the design competition. And they are exactly the same footprint of the original Twin Towers that came down. So we're standing near the original North Tower. And the design, which we can't get that close to, I guess, because they've sort of blocked it off completely from getting, but you can kind of get a sense of it, is essentially it's a large outline of the original footprint and then a big sheer drop down the bottom to a sort of an area where there's a waterfall running through the side. And Sterling's going to very adventurously, there we go, got up a little bit further. And then there's a second smaller hole or gap in the center where the water flows down into. And that's to kind of represent these two drops, the initial impact on the buildings and then their collapse. And then on the outside, there are 76 panels, each with the names of the 2,977 people who died in the 9/11 attacks, and an additional 6 people who died in the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993, the bombing that occurred, which obviously is now very much overshadowed by the later attacks. So every single name is on those panels, and the names are grouped by the people who knew each other in real life. So they tried to keep them together in terms of people who worked together, or people who would have known each other during the creation of the building. So they're not in alphabetical order. So you do see, really interesting and kind of sad little groupings on there, like the janitors have their own little section because they would have all known each other and worked each other in the building during their lives. And so it's a nice way to kind of keep people together in death. The building that's sort of in between these Callery pear trees is the 9/11 Memorial Museum. And that's, you can go down underneath the foundations of the buildings and see a lot of the twisted metal that's been preserved down there from the original collapse and rubble. And it also has down there more extensive memorial and resources dedicated to the people who died and their life stories and their families, and continues to be a major site for events, etc. This large building coming up here in front of us is World Trade Center number 3. These are all very recently completed and pretty new. So in fact, I've not even seen, before I came on this trip, the completed World Trade Center number 3. So it's been a long, long redevelopment story, about almost 20 years since the original attacks, and they're still kind of completing some of the buildings, but they're nearly done now. And now we are going to cross down in front of the World Trade Center buildings and then come back up into the financial district. This will take us about 2 or 3 minutes. So Stuart, if you've got any questions, you can ask them now.
Yeah. Just by any chance, could Sterling, I saw there was a fire engine just parked nearby.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, is too far away now? Don't worry about it. Yeah. It's just that one of the striking features to me of the 9/11 memorial, of those plaques with all the names, is all the first responders. And it was just almost this non-ending different ladder companies and fire engines and police departments and different security firms and different organisations that had first responders who died in the attack. And all of the any of the fire engine in the downtown area usually have a plaque on it listing the members of their brigade that died as first responders in the 9/11 attacks. And they're really quite moving. But it's fantastic to see it's now reopening up. I remember it took about 9 or 10 years. It was still just a hole in the ground. There was barricading all around. And in fact, Matthew, Joe Slovak, who is a guide we use in New York, he said to me after about 7 or 8 years, he said, I'm just embarrassed that nothing's happened. This is terrible. But there was all this political infighting, but it came down to the commercial consideration, because the owners of the buildings needed tenants to get the finance to rebuild the buildings, but no tenants would come down. And in fact, there's a bit of an analogy with COVID today. So once the towers had come down, people had moved out of the city to work out of the city, they were reluctant to come back down. And why would they? They've been working for years away from the centre of the city. And so they couldn't get the tenants to occupy the places. And as we touched on earlier, this probably will happen again with the COVID pandemic. There'll be a reluctance for tenants to fill up the office towers. And where you don't have tenants, you don't have income, you don't have money. And New York revolves totally around money.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, you could even, I think it's really interesting to think about, are we coming towards a paradigm shift? Is the era of the super big city going to come to an end if people can remote work? I've seen here many Americans who are permanently moving in that, and once they're permanently remote working, then they don't necessarily want to live in New York. They want to move to somewhere where it's cheaper to live, or somewhere where their interests are better served, or if they've got an interest in outdoorsy things, then they can live closer to that. So it could be, who knows, it could be a whole new era for large cities. Post-pandemic, we don't really know. So Sterling's just come in front of a memorial panel that was placed in front of a fire station that was right next door to the 9/11 site. Most of the members of this fire ladder company died during the attacks. And so this has become one of the first responders sort of memorial, areas in the city. So just like you were saying, Stuart, a lot of fire companies have things like this, but this one's a particularly famous example.
That's relatively new. I don't remember seeing that. But again, these things are constantly changing down there. But Brenda's just asked more. It seems to be a very walkable area around there. Are cars restricted, or are cyclists able to legally ride around these walking paths, or do they have separated bike paths?
There are some separated bike paths in the city, and there are more and more being built. Yes, you can see there's not a lot of traffic down here, and that's because a lot of it is restricted now. You can't actually just drive your car down here, and Sterling can kind of point some of the extensive security measures that are applied to private cars and things down here in the downtown area. Obviously, security is still a concern, and there's a lot of I wouldn't say paranoia, but certainly, kind of this sense that it's not completely over. No one totally feels safe. And so you do see a lot of that in New York City. And honestly, I think the downtown is better for it because it is a lot more walkable without having all the cars in here. And it probably it points the way of the future. For the financial district, they put a congestion tax like London's in New York just in the last couple of years. And although there's been grumbling, it has helped. The city is becoming more walkable, easier to navigate, because of course it was just choked by cars constantly before that.
One of those most iconic images of New York and nighttime photos is always of the steam coming out of the streets in the middle of the road. Can you explain to everyone about why this happens?
So there's a couple of reasons. One of the most kind of visible steam is caused by, there is literally an underground network of steam pipes that heat some of the older buildings in New York. For example, the Empire State Building, it is heated by a central citywide boiler system that pumps steam into the building to fuel all the radiators. When they were building some of these new skyscrapers in the 1920s and 1930s, this was a really interesting and cool idea to have a central steam boiler that was run by a utility company rather than having big boilers in every building individually. They no longer connect buildings up to the steam system anymore, as you can imagine, because we no longer use that to primarily heat buildings. And it is one of the most difficult systems to maintain in the world. It's extremely expensive and complicated to keep that steam running and to keep it, in its pipes. The pipes are aging. Some of them are 100 years old. So what often happens is it just starts leaking out of the system and comes up through the street. So you will see that happen a fair bit in the city. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is the subway also puts off exhaust and heat, and sometimes that comes up to the grills. But the really iconic steam is usually a leak or something, or an exhaust from the underground steam system. There's been talks about getting rid of all of that at some point, but it would cost probably billions of dollars, as you can imagine, to retrofit all of the Art Deco buildings to have modern heating systems. So, whenever they get around to all of that, who knows? But we're going to cross here into Zuccotti Park, which puts us, we're now kind of in the financial district, making our way to Wall Street. I wanted to point out this park for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it represents, it has a lot to do with a large black building that stands behind Zuccotti Park, which was called the US Steel Building when it was first constructed. It's now called One Liberty Plaza. In order to build super tall buildings in downtown New York, after the 1950s and 1960s, the New York City government made planning rules requiring very tall buildings over a certain height to donate certain amounts of land to the city as public space as compensation for breaking height laws. And Zuccotti Park is an example of one of these. It was built by the development company that built the US Steel Building and given as public space to the city. But the interesting about this, though, is that it became famous in 2011, and Stuart can show you a slide that shows Zuccotti Park during the Occupy Wall Street protests. This is where they occurred. This is where they camped out for days in October of 2011. People were living on this park. And the real specific reason for this is because it was given over by the developer to the city as public land, but it isn't actually public land. Technically, it's in a private covenant and still owned by the building, even though it is perpetually for public use, so they can't bar the public from entering the space. It isn't actually owned by the city. So the Occupy Wall Street's protesters, which became very famous in 2011, kind of shrewdly figured this out. And it took several months in court to sort of figure out whether the police could actually come onto this land and evict them, it technically being private property, although publicly covenanted. And so this is kind of why Occupy Wall Street occurred here. The other reason I wanted to point out Zuccotti Park and the US Steel Building is because of the building that used to be here. And it's a good example of the struggle to maintain downtown's heritage. Stuart can throw up a slide probably showing the original building on this site, which was the Singer Building. Singer Sewing Corporation had its headquarters here. And actually, it was the tallest building before the Woolworth Building. It was an incredible skyscraper that was completed in 1908. The Singer Building was kind of, again, an iconic postcard picture building of New York. And when they knocked it down to build this rather unimpressive Miesian box in the 1960s, it was very controversial because it was recognized as a very important heritage site. But the problem with a heritage skyscraper is, what do you do if no one's a tenant in there? If it's an old building and it can't afford to be run, how could you turn it even into a museum? What would you do with a skyscraper if you wanted to try and preserve it, protect it? Unless you've got tenants to use it, there's kind of no way you can save it. So even though everyone wanted to save the Singer Building, because it was so old and not really usable in the modern office environment, they ended up knocking it down. And this is a challenge faced by many downtown buildings today. There are some really beautiful skyscrapers that are in danger of being demolished because no one can figure out how to repurpose these buildings for the 21st century. And as we were kind of talking about earlier, if we come into an era where office space is no longer at a premium and they no longer need nearly as much in the downtown area, you might wonder what will happen to all these skyscrapers, because of course, they can't all be turned into museums. What will you do with them? So in a way, this is why New York's heritage is kind of always a little bit fleeting. It's difficult to preserve because of the changing way the city works. All right, we're going to walk now behind and go into Wall Street. We're going to dip down and come the back way onto Wall Street so I can show off one little tour stop, which is of endless fascination to me. I think we picked a good time. We've got all the lights coming on. It looks nice.
It actually looks stunning. It's a spectacular time with the lights coming on. It's also interesting. It's so obviously down in the old historic part of the city, because you don't have that rigid grid pattern, and so all of a sudden you get the windy, wiggledy historic street.
A lot of the streets here are still kind of based on what the Dutch originally laid down. So yes, they didn't use the grid. They had a sort of more eccentric system. So the building we're coming around to behind here, which I wanted to show you, this large sort of older sandstone colored building is called the New York Federal Reserve. So it's one of the Federal Reserve banks of the United States. The thing that is most interesting about this building is probably not what goes on above ground, but what goes on below. And Stuart can throw up a slide showing you. It is the home of basically one of the world's largest gold reserves. Everyone's kind of heard of Fort Knox in Kentucky, where the federal gold supply is, but this is where a lot of countries keep their gold stores. So what the New York Federal Reserve started doing at the turn of the century was holding on to countries and governments who maybe didn't want to risk having their gold supply in the country. So a lot of African countries, for example, have their gold reserves sitting here in New York rather than risking them falling to rebels or whatever in their home country. It's sort of such an interesting system that it means that sometimes international payments are settled in the basement of the Federal Reserve by simply moving gold bars from one country's reserve piles to others. And there are men, a special crew with white gloves that move around conducting these transactions. Sterling and I have gone on waiting lists to try and get a tour of the Federal Reserve Gold Vault. You can do it. It's extremely difficult. There's basically a months and months waiting list. We finally, after 5 years of trying, got our tickets to go in March of this year, of 2020. And of course, the pandemic hit. We couldn't get in. So we've been thwarted. But one day, they sent us a free keychain as compensation for all of our waiting. But one day we'll get in there and see it ourselves. But that's just one of the little kind of tidbits of Wall Street that I kind of find interesting. So we're walking down.
Sorry, just for the more shallow members of our audience, of course, it's famous because that's where Jeremy Irons stole the money during the movie Die Hard 3 with Bruce Willis. 40 years.
There you go.
Yeah.
So we're kind of right behind Wall Street here, and as we go towards onto the stock exchange itself, I wanted to point out this very tall building here, 40 Wall Street. Stuart can chuck up a slide showing the top of the building, which we can't really see from the ground here. You might also be able to make out on the sign in front of this building that it's one of Donald Trump's properties, although he only merely lends his name to it. He doesn't really own it. 40 Wall Street was part of what was called the race for the skies in the 1920s. It was part of a fierce competition alongside the Chrysler Building and the Empire State to be the new tallest building in New York. After the Woolworth Building sort of declined in prominence, it was the tallest for a long period. But then there was a sort of a spate of ambitious architects who wanted to exceed it in the 1930s. And as it happened, 40 Wall Street was in the competition with the Chrysler to be the tallest, but due to the Chrysler's sneaky crown design with a spire that was actually hidden inside the original design and just popped out when it was finished, it beat this building by a couple of feet. And so 40 Wall Street never had the privilege of being the tallest, but it's kind of part of the reason why the Chrysler Building is standing, and we'll see the Chrysler in our Midtown walk. We're going to come down behind. You see this sort of neoclassical building in front of us. This is the back of a building called Federal Hall. And this is actually the site of the first capital of the United States. The capital was initially in New York. Well, it was initially in Philadelphia, technically. But then when the government moved after George Washington's inauguration, it stayed here in New York in the earliest years in the 1780s. George Washington was inaugurated on the front steps of this building. It kind of was, expected, I suppose, that New York, being the largest and most important city in the United States, would be the future capital of the country as well. As we know, it didn't really happen that way. There was a whole lot of contestation over picking a capital for the United States, largely based on the political sensibilities of the urban North and the rural South. A famous bargain was struck that's kind of detailed in the musical Hamilton between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson over the site of the Capitol, where it was agreed that in exchange for helping nationalize debts that were incurred by the northern states during the American War of Independence, including New York, which was heavily indebted to pay its troops during that conflict, southern states would pitch in and help pay off those debts. In exchange, New York would not be allowed to be the federal capital, and it would be moved to a new neutral site that became Washington, D.C. So as a result, this Capitol building was kind of abandoned. abandoned and just became a customs house down here in the financial district. But it is technically one of the first capitals of the United States, and the Bill of Rights was signed in here in 1789. So it was an important building for various historical reasons. There's a statue of George Washington at the front, representing its importance to his first term of government, and it kind of remains a sort of important national historical park today. Then right across the street from Federal Hall is the New York Stock Exchange. This is Wall Street, although funnily enough, the New York Stock Exchange technically does not front onto Wall Street. It fronts onto Broad Street. Wall Street, for various reasons, has become the kind of symbolic name of the financial district down here in New York. The current stock exchange building dates to about 1904, and it's mostly facade, even though it has this kind of elaborate neoclassical look to the front of it. If you go behind it, it is essentially just a big glass wall. It's a huge glass kind of security box enclosing the floor of the stock exchange. There used to be public tours in there, but not since September 11th can you really go in there. Highly secure facility. The Wall Street of which we talk, we're actually standing on right here, and the reason it's called Wall Street is it used to be the wall between New Amsterdam and the rest of the city. So New Amsterdam was pretty small. It was just the sort of very southern tip of Manhattan. I've got a slide somewhere in there that shows you the map of the original New Amsterdam that's been reconstructed. And so we're standing right here on the edge of that, that farthest edge of the wall. You can see that's today's Wall Street. So the stock exchange was established here in the 1790s. I mean, part of the reason why New York became so famous financially as this big financial capital of the world is because of the actions of the stock exchange, and in part also because of the actions of New York. New York in the 1700s was one of the easiest places in the world to get a corporate license, and one of the most generous places when it came to limited liability. Whereas the rest of the world was slow to clue onto the idea of a limited liability corporation, New York State started issuing them really easily, so much so that many of the world's large companies were relocated here, and limited liability made for a big market in trading stocks and shares. So as a result of that kind of early innovation, New York emerged as this early financial capital, and it's still based here today. We can't walk actually, but I want to walk up to the little girl statue. So one of the newest features that's in front of the stock exchange is this statue called Standing Girl. And it was placed, well, it was originally placed a little bit further away near the famous statue of the Charging Bull. I've got a slide up there if you don't know what it looks like, but you're probably familiar with it as this kind of traditional artistic symbol of Wall Street that stands a bit further up in the city. So Standing Girl, a little bit about the history of these two statues, because it's kind of interesting. The bull statue was a piece of guerrilla art. A man named Arturo Di Madoka put it in front of Wall Street in 1989 as a overnight. He sort of had it. He wasn't commissioned to do anything. He made this statue and then had it sort of landed in front of the Wall Street as a kind of piece of guerrilla art. It became really popular with tourists as a symbol of the recovering United States in the Reagan era, and such was its popularity that eventually the city incorporated it and put it further down on Broadway as the kind of permanent installation. This little statue of Standing Girl then appeared in very much the same way in front of the location of Charging Bull in 2017. And it was placed by a group of Wall Street activists who wanted to complain about the lack of female representation on corporate boards. Arturo Di Madoka, the artist, complained bitterly about the placement of the statue, claiming that they, basically by having the bull now charging at a little girl, that the artist had illegally changed the meaning of his work. His work of the bull was supposed to be this sort of ebullient, exciting image of American industry, and now it looks like a bully. And so Madoko said this should be illegal. But of course, Madoko had originally put in the art illegally himself, so it was difficult to kind of assess whether his claim could really be legitimate. This argument went on for 3 years, and so when I was walking down here and doing tours, you'd see all sorts of kind of tourists, crowding around the two statues and interacting with them. Eventually, a compromise was found by the city, and they decided to move Standing Girl here, and so now it faces Wall Street directly. Well, now faces the stock exchange directly, and so it's kind of a cool, evidence of, I guess, there's always new things happening in the downtown area. We can walk up to Trinity Church and we can finish up there.
It's also interesting, leading on from Brenda's question earlier on. So there's this area that you're in right now, the Wall Street, outside the stock exchange. It is a completely pedestrian area. It's very hard for any vehicle to drive down. It's all barricaded off.
You can't just drive down to the stock exchange. Yeah, I mean, for obvious security reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. But it is rather ironic. It's the centre of capitalism and it's the centre of finance that they're protecting the most. Whereas the public buildings further up, there isn't such big restrictions on, but there is over the stock exchange building.
Yeah, well, and interesting even to question how long it will be the centre of finance, because of course floor trading is getting rarer and rarer. Once upon a time, the stock exchange, you would physically make trades in the exchange, but I think now, I was reading in the Times not so long ago, that makes up now than less than 0.1% of all trades are actually conducted on the floor. Most of them are done by digitally over the internet, over massive international servers. And during COVID, they shut the stock exchange down completely, and now they're only just letting traders in. But now they're kind of wondering, well, should there even really be a physical stock exchange like we sort of think now, or whether they'll end up moving that entirely. So who knows? The stock exchange may just move permanently completely online at some point. So
there still have to be somewhere for them to ring the bell so that when
that's right. Exactly. A lot of it's now just for the theatre of the IPO. And so they could, exactly, it's for corporate promotions.
Yeah.
And now finally we're going to end up here at Trinity Church. So this is another one of those old colonial era buildings that has managed to survive into the modern city. One of the richest parishes in the United States. The Trinity Church building design by Richard Upjohn is another neo-Gothical Anglican style church. It's the churchyard appears to be closed. Just commenting that we might have looked into. But Trinity Church was the original kind of Anglican parish for Manhattan and sort of the center of royal authority in old British New York. And again, it's kind of survives as one of the few reminders of a kind of a pre-modern times in the city. Where we're standing now, we're back on Broadway, and many of the world's largest companies and corporations are kind of wedged in and headquartered all around this little ideal. There is a cemetery attached to it that has numerous famous personages buried in it, including Alexander Hamilton. His grave is lit up in the distance there. I'm not sure if we can make it out. It looks like the church closed the churchyard, but it's the one that the lights are illuminating a big square cenotaph in the distance, but I'm not sure how well you can see it.
Yeah, no.
But yeah, anyway, we're now down at probably towards the end of our tour.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic.
Questions to finish us up.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. I very jokingly made a comment at the very beginning about, let's go take a bite out of the Big Apple. And obviously New York's famous as that name of the Big Apple. Can you give us a bit of background on how it got that name?
So there's no real agreement over where that name comes from. The prevailing theory that you'll read probably most commonly is it was the name of a famous horse race that used to go on. It was a bit like the Kentucky Derby or the Preakness Stakes. There was the Big Apple horse race that occurred in New York, and that's the closest they've been able to say, well, maybe it came from that. But there isn't actually a really good definitive explanation, as far as I know, of where this name comes from. There are theories, but that's, it's one of those things that's emerged.
Yeah, another one I heard was in the late 20s jazz musicians come out from the South. There was a scene as taking your chance, and you'd go and try and take a bite out of the apple to take your chance in life and move to New York. And that's how I've got its name. But again, I think it's an awful lot of clever marketing by the New York Tourism Authority to use that name, use the spread of the thing. Anyway, it's obviously a very good place to end. Thank you, as always, Matthew.